Afternoon, all, and first of all, our apologies for this small delay due to a strike on the Portuguese trains. So, dear Professor Laura Lidons, dear colleagues, dear students, good afternoon and welcome to the third conference of the second year of the annual research seminar of the Center for the History of Society and Culture with the title The Worlds of History, New Perspectives and Debates. For those of you who attended this seminar for the first time, I would like to start by briefly recalling that the aim of it is to invite distinguished scholars from different fields of history, originating from various parts of the world, and working on distinct chronologies from medieval to modern history to deliver conferences that help us to foster new ways of thinking about how to do history, not only in Portugal, but also on larger spatial scales. We want to challenge, especially the younger generations. Most part of the attendance are our students. We want to challenge, especially the younger generations, to dialogue with some of the most prestigious and innovative historians to discuss their cutting-edge research, their knowledge, their methodologies, and the problems they address. Today, we welcome Professor Laura Lidons, and it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce her. Professor Downs was educated in arts at Harvard College and after earned her PhD in history in 1987 from the prestigious Columbia University in New York. She started her academic career back in 1988 as professor of history at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor in the USA. In 2001, she moved to Paris, becoming directeur d'études at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, where, in 2004, she created the program Recherche interdisciplinaire sur les mondes britanniques. Currently, she is professor of history at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, where since 2012 she holds the chair in gender history. Meanwhile, Professor Laura Downs was visiting professor at different prestigious universities, as were the cases of the Institute of French Studies at the University of New York during 2007, or Yale University during a semester in 2011. She is member of the editorial board of some distinguished journals, like the 20th Century British History, a Q1 journal published by Oxford University Press. In the most recent years, she has been principal investigator on the ERC Advanced Grant Project titled Social Politics in European Borderlands 1870-1990, a Comparative and Transnational History. This project seeks to reframe the history of welfare and social care in modern Europe by restoring to view the contributions of local actors, primarily families and associations, to shaping welfare systems in three European borderlands: Galicia in Spain, the northeastern Adriatic, and the Franco-Belgian-German border regions from the late 19th to the late 90s in the 20th century. I guess that during today's conference, Professor Laura Downs will tell us something more about the results already achieved in this project. Professor Downs is also vice chair of the cost action Who Cares in Europe, which the action's purpose, this action's main purpose, with partners from different European universities, is to discuss how state welfare emerged from the social welfare provided by non-profit, non-state institutions and individuals, how it has developed and changed over time, and how, especially in recent years, it has entered into crisis in many countries. A crisis that, I would say, is critical currently, as we have seen in the last days with the huge demonstrations and chaos that they created in France, for instance. Laura Lidons was distinguished with several fellowships and scientific awards. I just mentioned two of them. Between 2010 and 2014, the Prime d'Excellence Scientifique du Ministère de la Recherche Nationale de France and the Pickney Prize for the best book in French history written by a North American. This prize distinguished her book, Gender Division in the French and British Metalworking Industries, 1914-1939, published by Cornell University Press in 1995. This is an excellent book in which we can learn in detail about the impact of World War I in the women's labour conditions in France and Great Britain by exploring how gender ideology influenced outcomes in a world where non-market institutions were essential. There, we can access the voices of women workers, but also of women welfare supervisors, government officials, and employers. Professor Laura Lidons, other than this book, as all of you might expect, published extensively in different topics with an emphasis on France and Great Britain comparative labour history, history and social theory, comparative history of childhood, comparative history of social protection, and, of course, gender studies. Gender history. Usually with approaches familiar to comparative history, a trademark of the European University Institute, if I might say it, and also she's open to the perspectives of transnational history. I will not mention all the titles she authored, but one. I could have chosen it for several reasons. One of that reasons is that 2 days ago we celebrated the International Women's Day to remember that relevant day of March the 8th, 1857, when in New York a group of female textile workers marched in protest of unfair working conditions and unequal rights for women. In the book titled Writing Gender History, a book with a second and revised edition by Bloomsbury in 2010, Laura Dones explores the evolution of historical writing about women and gender from the 1930s until the present. With chapters on the history of Europe, the USA, colonial India and Africa, the discussion moves from women's history to gender history. Professor Downs also debated recent scholarship on race, gender and sexuality in colonial and transnational history, and on the history of the body. Lynn Hunt, professor of modern history at the UCLA, Los Angeles, California, commented that the book, and I quote her, puts the entire range of women's and gender history into context, showing how it challenges the conventional places, opens up new veins of research, and transforms our understanding of every aspect of history. Her command of the literature is simply astounding, sure to be seen as a landmark in the development of the field of history in the broadest sense. I think that this quotation reveals the quality and deep impacts of Laura Lidon's historical research. Dear Professor Laura Lidons, we are very grateful for having you here today with us at the University and Coimbra, And now it's time for your conference. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You can talk from there, from here, whenever you want. If you
want
use
to,
the PowerPoint, it's better to
I'm
be
going to
there.
put myself over there.
Okay. And if you don't mind, I move to here in order that I can see.
Yes, of course. First of all, thank you very much for your kind and generous introduction, and also for inviting me here, and for the warm welcome that I've received in first Lisbon at midnight when my plane finally landed, and then today here in Coimbra. So I want to start by showing you a 90-second trailer for my ERC project, because today I'm going to speak mostly about the ERC project in one way or another. And so in order to do this, do I just hit anything? Oh, I see. Okay, great. Can we hear the... doesn't have the music, but that's all right.
Está no máximo aqui, não deve estar aqui.
Ali no comando da televisão, talvez.
Veja aí o volume do comando da televisão. Mas já está algo suficiente. I think we will have a mute video. Não está.
Não é. Ele não está a passar no som.
Okay. So the project is called Social Politics in European Borderlands.
Excuse me, because we can hear you, but it's better, especially for the recording of this.
Of course. Thank you, Joseph. So the project is called the project is called Social Politics in European Borderlands, 1870s to the 1990s, a comparative and transnational study. And when we got the ERC, I got the ERC, I guess, one of the first things that we did was made a trailer that summarizes the project in 90 seconds. And so that is what I'm going to show you now. What you're looking at here is our project logo. If you get an ERC project, you have to have a logo. This isn't just, an optional thing. You must have a logo. So, our logo. Here we go. how to now move from the... Sorry again. Okay. This looks like the thing I'm looking for. Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna. So I'm going to start today by talking about the project and just the sort of larger structures of the project. There are 9 of us working on this project. We've got several people working on each of our 3 borderlands. As I mentioned, the northeastern Adriatic, the Franco-Belgian, Luxembourg, German border regions, and also Galicia, but it's not Galicia in Spain. It's the Galicia that got invaded by Russia about 2 years, just over a year ago. So, which has been a huge problem for my project. Yeah, but it's also a huge problem for the Ukrainian people, so I can't really complain. So let me get us to slide 1 if I can. Let's do that. Yes, I did it. Wow. I've changed the title of the talk. As you can see, when social welfare became a bordering practice, marking new national frontiers in the Upper Adriatic borderlands. Elena de Osta's Opera Patriottica di Assistenza all'Italia Redenta, 1919 to 1950. And the reason that I did this, actually it's 1924, anyway. The reason that I changed the title is that I wanted to give you an example from my own research of how it changes the way you do historical research and analysis to think about borders and bordering practices and in borderland regions in particular. So I hope this comes across clearly. And now let me begin. So my ERC project, Social Politics in European Borderlands, seeks to reframe the history of welfare and social care in modern Europe by restoring to view the contribution of local actors, primarily families and associations, to shaping welfare systems in 3 European borderlands. The project, which has its acronym is SocioBoard, thus turns our attention to the co-construction of social assistance by public and private actors in 3 borderland contexts, marked by social, cultural, economic, religious, or ethnic diversity. Here, in Europe's borderlands, the reach of central states often fluctuated, and a range of welfare structures based on national, but also on non-national, forms of identity and solidarity flourished. By exploring social care in Eastern, Southeastern, and Northwestern European borderlands over an extended period of time, we intend to examine the similarities and divergences across a long 20th century while bringing the histories of social protection in East and West, North and South, socialist and post-socialist, fascist and post-fascist, and liberal democratic regimes into dialogue with each other. We do this by placing intensively researched case studies of local phenomena in comparative and transnational frameworks, examining similarities and differences between Northwestern, Eastern, and Southeastern borderlands, while tracing the circulation of concepts, people, and practices. Within each case study, and our project has 9 case studies, 9 people, 9 case studies, we are deploying a highly innovative triadic approach that emphasizes the dynamic relationships among 3 distinct actors: voluntary welfare associations, families, and states, who interact at different levels and in multiple ways in the construction of social protection. Inasmuch as it gives primary attention to local actors, the triadic approach assumes a bottom-up perspective. yet it does so without ever losing sight of the state and its local manifestations. In this way, SocioBoard recovers the contributions of families and associations in developing new forms of social care, as well as the forms of local knowledge that these civil society actors brought to their work. The project's double optic, a triadic approach plus focus on borderlands, is allowing Team SocioBoard to examine a wide range of local welfare structures based on national but also non-national forms of identity and solidarity. Focusing on these overlapping and at times competing structures of social provision allows us to explore the interplays between inclusion and exclusion that have long shaped European welfare provision by homing in on those contexts where such competition was especially visible. For it is our conviction that the long-range historical study of local actors' ideas and practices around social welfare in European borderlands has much to tell us about the development of welfare across Europe in general. Now, one major challenge of this project is to bring together two well-established multidisciplinary fields: borderland studies on the one hand, and welfare studies on the other hand. And these two fields have yet to really engage with one another. There's no literature out there yet which brings these two fields together. But the very shape and structure of the SocioBoard inquiry demands that we bring these two fields into dialogue. For if welfare is the angle from which we approach bordering practices, practices which are themselves inflected by local structures of social provision, borderlands in turn shape local patterns of provision, as we can see when we compare those patterns with the structure of provision prevailing in adjacent nation states. Our project thus asks, what is specific to borderland welfare, and suggests that the answer to that question lies in the multiplicity and intensity of exchanges across a local field that is fragmented along numerous lines of solidarity and identity, including gender, religion, occupation, language, or ethnic/national identity, to name just a few of the most salient and recurring forms. The key to managing the extended geographical scope and long chronology lies in the project's in-depth and carefully chosen case studies, which allow for comparison across distant contexts while simultaneously tracing the transfer of ideas, institutions, and practices of social action among the three regions. We have chosen to organize the research around a series of studies that involve mobilizations of local actors on behalf of three groups of beneficiaries: children, working-class women, and veterans. By combining the bottom-up perspective of the triadic approach to welfare with a focus on three beneficiaries of social action, the project creates a clear grid that is enabling transversal and comparative analysis across the three borderlands. Now, in the time that remains, I would like to present a part of my own case study on gender, social action, and politics in the northeastern Adriatic borderlands from about 1890 until the end of the 1970s. My principal organization, the Opera Nazionale Assistenza all'Italia Redenta, or ONAIR, enjoyed an unusually long life in Italy's northeastern borderlands. Indeed, it managed to successfully navigate the numerous regimes which rose and fell in this highly contested borderland from 1919 to 1978, all the while continuing to deliver social services to young children and their families, especially their mothers. And those services were primarily nursery schools, school meals, and medical services to young children and to their families. So, here is a map of my borderland in the early 1920s. What this map indicates quite clearly is that in addition to being a border region, let me step away here, the dotted line indicates the border between the new border drawn in 1921 between northeastern Italy and Yugoslavia. Before, there was no border there, because all of this region before was the southern littoral of the Habsburg Empire. So what this is it shows us that in addition to being a border region, this region, called Venezia Giulia, was also a post-imperial territory. And this is important in the work that I'm doing. It's vital for the first several years of my organization's work, because the Venezia Giulia, even after the end of the war and the collapse of the Habsburg Empire, Habsburg law continued to rule this region. Italian law didn't become effective. It couldn't be applied before January of 1923. So that's kind of a long time. So the Venezia Giulia had been governed by Habsburg law and institutions until the abrupt collapse of that empire at the end of October 1918. And what I'll show today is that ONER shaped its welfare interventions with an eye to effacing previous imperial structures and replacing them with visibly Italian ones. This is a very interesting thing to explore through the lens of welfare. So in this way, the ONER marked the territory as Italian land well before the boundaries between Italy and the Yugoslavia had been settled. So let's see. Today I will focus on the association's early years, a very dense and eventful period that lasted from mid-July to late October, mid-July 1919 to late October 1924. I use this exceptionally rich case study to explore how new borders and a new political order immediately manifested themselves in local welfare provision. I thus hope to offer a convincing and empirically rooted demonstration of one pathway by which welfare practices shaped bordering processes, and bordering processes in turn shaped welfare in an early 20th century southeastern European border region that was at once a post-imperial space and a contact/conflict zone between Slovenians, Croatians, and Veneto-speaking Italians. When ONER's first 18 volunteers, all of them women, arrived in Trieste in July 1919, they formed the spearhead of a wide-ranging civilian relief initiative in the impoverished, war-torn, and conflict-ridden Venezia Giulia. It's important to recall that this region, the map is gone, it's important to recall that this region is the principal battleground between Italy and the Habsburg monarchy in the First World War. So there was tremendous destruction. Beyond the emergency distribution of food, clothing, and medicine lay a longer-term socio-medical and educative project of ministering to the region's very poorest women and children with an eye to conquering their loyalties for Italy's expansive nationalist and nationalizing program. As many of the organizations already active in the region targeted children of primary school age, particularly orphans, Italia Redenta, that is my organization, set its sights on a younger population, creating nursery schools where the women of Italia Redenta fed, clothed, and educated in Italian the young children, aged 3 to 6, of local Slavophone, Italophone, and mixed language families, while offering their mothers paid work making clothing in the organization's numerous sewing and knitting workshops. And this clothing was then sold at very low prices to needy people in the region. Brainchild of the Duquesa Elena d'Aosta, the ONER was in its origins an overwhelmingly female organization. In its early days, it was also an organization which drew many of its volunteers from Italy's social and political elites. This would gradually change as the aristocrats shifted the base of their participation in the association from the upper Adriatic back to Rome or to their own home districts, replacing their well-heeled boots on the ground with long-distance financial and moral support, while the local ONER branch, whose seat was in Trieste, came to rely increasingly on women and a few men from the local middle and small town lower middle classes. Now, the elite, largely aristocratic makeup of ONER's first group of cadres, which includes a member of the royal family, the Duquesa d'Aosta, reminds us of the central role played by well-to-do social activists. These women served as unpaid volunteers in Italy's chronically underfunded mixed economy of welfare. These women were skilled medical professionals. They were all nurses who had seen service on the front lines during World War I. So they were trained and experienced. Yet thanks to their privileged class background, they could offer their skills for free to Italy's underdeveloped welfare system as a means of engaging in patriotic service to the Italian state and to its newest citizens. ONER's elite cadre also signaled that the association had close ties to the state and, as we shall see, to the army as well. Hence, at the ONER's constituent meeting held at the Palazzo Quirinale on the 30th of August 1919, elite women such as Antonia Nidi, who was wife of the Prime Minister, rubbed shoulders with several key government officials who were there to ensure a smooth collaboration between ONER and the general civil commissariats appointed to administer Italy's new provinces. These commissariats were they were a temporary form of administration. They weren't government really, because they weren't elected people. They were appointed often members of the army, actually, or from the Carabinieri. And so these commissariati are what made the rules and distributed funding in these two regions on the northeast of Italy after World War I. So, the commander Francesco Salata, who was head of the Central Office for Italy's new provinces, spoke at some length that day about the relationship between the Italian government and the ONER. And I quote, "The opera," that is to say the ONER, "partly replaces the action of the government, on whose support it must therefore be able to rely. Indeed, the ONER will be able to carry out a more agile and prompt action than the government, not being bound to special formalities nor subject to multiple checks." End quote. Salata then took steps to ensure that a part of the welfare funds currently being sent to the General Civil Commissariats be redirected to the ONER's regional offices in Trento and Trieste. For as he concluded, and I quote, "The opera must be able to rely on a solid financial base, independent of any contributions that might arrive thanks to spontaneous charity." End quote. Now, ONER's high level of interaction with the state may not fit everybody's idea of a civil society organization, but it is by no means an isolated example in 20th century Europe, and this is something we can talk about more in the discussion if you'd like to. Moreover, Italia Redenta's close collaboration with the occupying army and with the General Civil Commissariat that succeeded it reminds us of the many forms that the state takes in borderland regions: imperial state, absent state, weak state, occupying army. This is part of what's complicated but interesting about borderland regions, is that the state is usually not very present, or it might like sometimes zoom in on an area, like the Venezia Giulia, and then withdraw again and just kind of leave it to its own devices. So let's step back for a moment and take a quick look at the context in which these women arrived in or returned to this war-devastated region, where many of them, including the Duchessa d'Aosta herself, had served in hospitals on the front lines. The Julian March, renamed Venezia Giulia by an Italian state which anticipated gaining full possession of the region in the post-war, post-Versailles redrawing of borders in 1919 to 20, had seen some of the most punishing battles of the war. Farms, villages, and towns were repeatedly crisscrossed by the opposing armies, occupied by troops and often severely bombed, leaving thousands of civilians homeless or displaced, even as the reach of Habsburg aid associations shrank dramatically. The end of the war signaled the passage of this region from the southeastern fringes of the Habsburg Empire to the newly formed Yugoslavian state on the one hand, and the newly expanded Italian one on the other. The recent history of war and imperial collapse profoundly destabilized local relations between state and civil society. Already frayed by 1916 to 17, thanks to growing wartime difficulties in provisioning the regional towns, notably Trieste, the collapse of the Habsburg Empire at the end of October 1918 led swiftly to a crisis in the rule of law and of the legitimate monopoly of violence. Nearly 2 weeks before the armistice, striking workers were taken to the streets in the thousands, while returning prisoners of war rioted, looting shops and warehouses in Trieste as early as the 31st of October. While the occupying army, Italian army, was able to control civil strife until its withdrawal in early August 1919, the General Civil Commissariat, which remained in the region to represent Italian state authority, proved far less successful in quelling the recurring bouts of social and political conflict that would wrap the entire region over the next 3 to 4 years. This created very difficult conditions of work for Italia Redenta activists, and more importantly, shaped their understanding of what their nationalist mission to the Julian region meant in everyday, on-the-ground terms. I just read a report in the airplane last night, actually, a report from the very beginning of 1920 on a train shipment of material, textiles and other things necessary for these sewing and knitting workshops. This train car was attacked by brigands coming into Trieste, and the soldier who'd been assigned to guard it was murdered. So it was. So these were not safe working conditions. These were difficult working conditions, and things didn't always get there. Things shipped from the Milan to Trieste didn't always make it. So. Now, Italia Redenta's humanitarian action was also an eminently political and nationalist one, concerned with what they called the patriotic penetration of Venezia Giulia's Slavophone population. When I say Slavophone, I mean people who speak or spoke Slovenian and Croatian, because those are the two Slavic languages that are primarily spoken in the region. There is some Serbian too. So they sought the patriotic penetration of these populations and their assimilation into the Italian nation via socio-medical assistance and language instruction, especially to very young children. In a region that had been laid waste by 4 years of war, Onayer's initial campaign to penetrate the region via social action was facilitated by the extraordinarily widespread need for assistance of every kind and the inability of local institutions and authorities to meet that need on their own. Indeed, with the collapse of the empire and consequent loss of its financial support, local authorities, municipal authorities, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer depth and breadth of the misery that stalked their towns and villages. High levels of unemployment and of infant mortality, thousands of orphaned and abandoned children, an illegitimate birth rate that was 3 to 4 times higher than the average for the rest of Italy. Remember all those demobilized soldiers? Anyway, and the widespread destruction of public and private buildings had filled their streets with hungry people, many of them women and children, begging openly or prowling in search of food. Under such conditions, municipal authorities often welcomed Italia Redenta, whether or not they had reservations about the association's ulterior goal of Italianizing the region, as many of them surely did. So let's move on. The owner's initial brief was assistance to what they call la prima infancia, which is basically babies and very young children. But also assistance to the mothers of those children by putting them to work in these knitting workshops. So, hence the initial focus on putting mothers to work while caring for their children in daycare centers that were attached to the owner workshops. In a region ravaged by malaria and tuberculosis and beset by high levels of malnutrition, the women of Italia Redenta were immediately obliged to expand their mission to include badly needed medical services to mothers and young children. These latter were delivered via a network of dispensaries and walk-in clinics that were attached to several of the larger Omer nursery schools. Thanks to their shrewd policy of working in close collaboration with the General Civil Commissariat and the relevant municipal authorities, Omer activists were able to move with remarkable agility. Having already established an important beachhead in Trieste in early October 1919, Italia Redenta went on in November to open 4 nursery, workshop, medical clinic complexes. So they're polyvalent complexes. The nursery school is right there next to the workshop where the mothers work, and there's a medical clinic right there so that they can get medicine and medical treatment. So they opened 4 of these complexes in several of the most important frontier towns, including Gorizia, Monfalcone, Tolmino, and Ravenna. Over the next 5 years, Omer would function as a kind of a nursery school startup, organizing schools and polyvalent health, education, and welfare centers in 15 towns, villages, and port cities from the Alto Isonzo to the Adriatic shore. By 1925, they would have organized 21 such nursery school complexes in the region. Alongside their startup activity, Italia Redenta offered material and technical assistance to a wide range of existing socio-medical and educational institutions across the entire region. These latter were chosen with an eye to supporting those structures that might affect the life chances of very young children, who were the opera's central concern. Italia Redenta activists were particularly concerned with the harsh fate of the region's many illegitimate babies who were either abandoned at birth by their young unmarried mothers or thrown onto the streets with their mothers by families for whom both mother and child were a daily reminder of the shame that their daughters' illegitimate unions had brought onto the entire household. As Oner's regional inspector, Clara Valli, reported in December 1921, and I quote, "The problem of infants born and abandoned in misery is of particular interest to the Oner, which, while carrying out its action in this region, has often witnessed the lacerating spectacle of a baby abandoned at birth, or a young mother and her infant rejected by her family because the child was the fruit of an illegitimate union. There are no hospitals to receive them, no assistance of any kind, and they have no hope of sustaining themselves through work in order to support another being. End quote. The lack of foundling hospitals for abandoned infants, what the Italians call brefotrofi, in these former Habsburg lands, swiftly spurred the Omer to action. By December 1919, Valle had installed a modernized version of this traditional Italian institution, the brefotrofio, but she called it the Casa Materna. And she installed the Casa Materna in a small hospital abutting the organization's headquarters. Here, 16 mothers, most of them unwed, and 22 nurslings, some of them orphaned or abandoned, were housed and cared for by Omer's trained staff. Pressed by the desperately poor health conditions in the region, Italia Redenta pioneered two forms of social assistance that were new to Italy at the time. The first of these was the nursery school complex, which placed the school at the heart of a larger polyvalent health, education, and welfare center, an unusual structure that doubtless owes its shape to the fact that the initial organizers and leaders of this socio-educational initiative were nurses rather than teachers or pedagogues. The second was the Casa Materna, which lodged modern medical care for mothers and their infants within the traditional collective structure of the foundling hospital. This was an idea that fascist Italy's premier child welfare organization, the Opera Nazionale Maternità ed Infanzia, would later adopt. Like the liberal national government in Rome and its regional representatives in the General Civil Commissariat, the first wave of Oner activists understood the Venezia Giulia's particularity in part through its Habsburg heritage of law and custom. This emerged clearly in discussions of the Casa Materna, which was hastily installed in November-December 1919 to meet what struck Oner activists as a crying need for brefotrofi in a land where there were none. Though well aware that under still valid Habsburg law, unwed mothers and their families have the right, if rarely the means, to sue the fathers of their illegitimate children for child support, Oner activists did not turn their efforts to supporting paternity suits. Rather, they opted to resurrect an ancient Italian institution, the Foundling Hospital, or brefotrofio, which was generally run by nuns, with an eye to disciplining the wayward young mothers for the sin they had committed with the child's father. The Casa Materna was a modernized version of this archaic institution, with medically trained staff and a mission to support unwed mothers rather than punish them. Through practical measures like shelter, food, medical care, and eventually the opportunity to earn a small wage in one of Oner's workshops. The decision to implant an updated version of a traditional Italian institution, the brefotrofio, rather than giving unwed mothers free legal assistance to pursue the absent fathers under still valid Habsburg law, also signals the Oner's larger ambition, which was to reframe single motherhood as a moral question with implications for the larger community, rather than a legal one with implications solely for the single mother, her child, and eventually the child's father. Instead of seeking redress in the courts, unwed mothers and their infants were to be cared for and disciplined by the community. Oner's welfare strategy regarding unwed mothers was thus a way to mark the terrain politically, to announce the arrival of a new moral and political order in the Venezia Giulia, grounded in the modernization of a traditional Italian and Catholic instrument of disciplinary care, while supplanting and effacing the technically still valid Habsburg option of suing for paternity. It was, in other words, a way to Italianize, via new models of social assistance, these post-imperial Habsburg borderlands. And I quote Clara Valli, "If the opera can build this, the only foundling hospital in Trieste, and then implant 12 more like it in the Venezia Giulia, the Italia Redenta will have given benefit of unquestionable value to this region. And she wrote this to the Executive Council back in Rome, hoping to gain both moral and financial support for this unexpected venture, taken on Valley's initiative when the opportunity to create such a hospital presented itself. And for several years, she had full support from the Executive Council back in Rome. The Casa Materna was funded from 1919 until the end of 1922. But then, no more. And let me explain why this was not destined to be in the long range. Let's see. In early December 1922, just weeks after the fascist march on Rome and Mussolini's forced ascent to the position of Prime Minister, Elena D'Aosta announced to her team a radical shift in ONER's strategy. Henceforth, the organization would relinquish all institutions established in urban centers like Trieste or Gorizia, where the population was already largely Italian-speaking, even though their first language was likely to have been Slovenian, German, Hungarian, Croatian, Friulian, Czech, Greek, or Serbian. But usually they spoke Italian as well. So the new program was to relinquish all institutions, and medical dispensaries, nursery schools, to turn them over to the municipal authorities in places like Gorizia and Trieste, and focus their action exclusively on those small villages and towns that lay on the linguistic frontiers of the region, where non-Italian speakers constituted an important, often dominant percentage of the population. Well, I'll show you on the map. Basically, they moved east. The focus of their action moved east. And the institutions that they built were built further east. As a consequence, initiatives like the Casa Materna, no matter how successful or badly needed, would no longer be a part of ONER's brief. Henceforth, the association will be confined to creating and running Italian language nursery schools targeting Slavophone and mixed language children in particular, in accordance with the new government's plans for implementing more forcible strategies of assimilation in Italy's new frontier regions. This decision was driven largely by financial constraints, as foundling hospitals were far costlier to operate than were nursery schools. But several ONER activists, notably Clara Valle, would need to be persuaded that the ONER's new path was actually faithful to the organization's initial patriotic spirit of social assistance to all who dwelt in Italy's new provinces. So Council Delegate Donna Luzzatto thus broke news of the big changes to come as gently as she could. Some changes are required, she said, due to the force of circumstance as well as the need to make economies. And she announced this during an exceptional meeting on the 2nd of December 1922, during which the council delegate, Luzzatto, hoped to bring all council members together in an accord around ONER's new program in advance of the official meeting, which was going to happen 2 days later, and which would be presided over by the Duchessa d'Aosta. And therefore harmony had to reign. So that harmony had to be built on the 2nd of December. And it's a very interesting document from that meeting, as she tries to persuade the activists that they basically leave the Italian families to the cities where they live and focus on the people who speak other languages. Focus on the peasants in the mountains and on the Adriatic coast. Not everybody was convinced right away. Henceforth, she said, we will have to deploy our funds to intensify the patriotic propaganda in La Slavia. The new program the opera is preparing to implement is very promising and gives hope of an effective patriotic penetration in the new lands now reunited with the homeland. She concluded brightly, hoping to persuade the ONER Executive Council of the new, more politicized path that the ONER social assistance would henceforth follow. But Caravalli remained unconvinced and announced that it was her intention to resign from the ONER altogether. Luzzato's admission 2 months later that, and I quote, active propaganda is the only way to continue to obtain funds from both the government and the local secretariats, end quote. This signaled a profound shift in the association's relationship to the Italian government with the arrival in power of Mussolini and the gradual consolidation of fascist rule. So the purse strings were going to be held much more tightly, basically, and the women of the ONER were going to be deployed in a much more politicized way, much more aggressively in the Northeast and on the Adriatic. After 3.5 years of building new institutions according to the visible needs of the local population, ONER's future funding would henceforth be contingent on dropping the mask of disinterested social assistance and pursuing an overtly political program of patriotic penetration of the small towns and villages on the linguistic frontiers of the Venezia Giulia. This map shows you where it is that this shows you where they were: Monfalcone, Gorizia, there's Trieste, and they move out of those areas and they move over toward the Isonzo River and up toward Tarvisio. So they basically move to where they think the boundary line is going to be placed, and in any event, where the linguistic boundary is. They move to where Italian peters out. There is no more mixed language. It's all Slovenian up here, and then down here in Istria, which goes down like that, Croatian. So, and they were really obsessed about this language thing. But there's an interesting exception that was made for ONER's nursery school in Trieste. Get out of here. Whoops, sorry. There was one nursery school in the city of Trieste in a working class district called Rozzo. And an exception was made for this nursery school. Even after Mussolini's rise to power, this nursery school would continue to be supported by ONER and run by ONER activists. And this makes clear that the region's linguistic frontiers were in fact extremely elastic. The boundary could reach as far west as Trieste, departing from the official line that separated Italy from Yugoslavia, in order to curl itself around the city's ultra-working-class district of Rozzo. And I quote, "For now, we will continue to assist the nursery school in Rozzo, a largely communist center which is also made up of Slavic elements," unquote. And that's again Bono Luzzatto. Though located in a largely Italian-speaking city, the nursery school in Rozzo would be accorded the same status as those which ONER had established in the small towns of Canale, Tolmino, Duino, and Maturie, all of which stood on the far reaches of the region's linguistic frontiers. I don't know if you can see them on here, but Well, there's Duino. This whole area was much more Slovenian speaking, and over here was more Italian. So anyway, it's complicated, the mixture of languages. So the point is that the linguistic frontiers and the political frontier are they don't really line up. And it's the linguistic frontier and its elasticity that is really striking in this case. So in late March 1923, the ONER handed its Casa Materna over to Trieste's Association for the Defense of Minors, over loud objection from its founder, Caravalli. This association quickly transformed the Casa Materna into an orphanage, leaving unwed mothers outside the ambit of social care and social discipline. Valli objected one last time, and then she resigned and disappeared from the ONER altogether. Her last trace in the archive coincides with her last day of service on the 30th of April, 1923, when she was officially replaced by her assistant, Edvige Constantino, whose ideas about ONER's mission in the region were more congruent with those of the new fascist regime. 6 months later, the Gentile reform of the Italian education system placed the nursery school at the core of early childhood education, transforming a service that had functioned basically as daycare into schools of the so-called preparatory grade for elementary education. So Gentile saw, it became strategic. Nursery schools, no matter where they were founded in Italy, became strategic institutions of early childhood education. They weren't made obligatory until 1968, but from 1923 until 1968, they were seen as absolutely strategic and critical for the life chances, particularly of poor and working class children. So, so the nursery school got a big leg up in people's opinions, and so for the next 55 years, the ONER would continue to run nursery schools in this region. Even if its boundaries changed, it didn't matter. The ONER ran the nurseries. Whatever nursery schools they had, those nursery schools were made by this association, and it continued doing this until the mid-1970s. So, if Italy's post-war occupation of the former Habsburg littoral had provoked one sea change in the kinds of welfare services provided in the region, the political crisis of autumn 1922 soon provoked another. For Caravalli's loss in the face of Rome's new masters marked a profound shift in the orientation of ONER's Upper Adriatic branch. Hence, the conflict that suddenly erupted over the Casa Materna in January of 1923 was not a mere blip on the road, on the road to ONER's self-appointed destiny as the Upper Adriatic's primary, I'm missing something. Well, it doesn't matter. What was I saying? It's on here. Yeah, I'm sorry. It's a defeat that, as the Upper Adriatic's primary nursery school provider, it was rather a defeat that interrupted the organic development of this polyvalent aid organization 4 years into its work in the Upper Adriatic region, and set it on a more narrowly focused path in line with the new government plans for implementing more forcible strategies of assimilation in Italy's new frontier lands. Let's see, what do I have here? Oh, there it is. It is a classic example of how bordering processes can reshape welfare provision, shifting the focus of action from one social group to another, in this case from unemployed women workers in urban districts and their young children, to non-Italian speaking children on the region's linguistic frontiers, while changing the location of that action as well. So I hope that these two cases, the case of what happens after Mussolini's rise to power, and the Casa Materna, I hope they give convincing demonstrations of the interest of looking at welfare, of putting welfare and borderland studies together, and using the border as a lens through which to think about welfare, and also welfare as a strategy for establishing borders. So I'll just leave you with a couple of pictures to give you an idea of what these, what went on in these nursery schools. There was a lot of hand washing. I've seen so many photos of kids washing their hands. You wouldn't believe it. For those of you who studied the First World War, Caporetto, which in Slovenian is Kovarid, is where the Italian army was defeated in October 1917. I'm seeing heads nod. And then these are all photos that ONAIR had. They had a photographer, I think, and this photographer went around taking pictures, usually in the schools, but also, as we saw in the previous picture, outdoors, because doing stuff outdoors was considered really important. You know, the sunshine and the fresh air. So, thank you very much for your attention.